Hello everyone, it's been a little while since I've made a video, and it's also been a while since I've made a video on any sort of a content like a movie or certainly a television show or anything like this. But this is a special occasion, and I'm actually coming out with this pretty late because I've been slightly bitter about this whole experience of watching, Star Trek come back to the television screen, and I've not been happy with what I saw. So I wasn't happy with the first two episodes, and that's what's going to be the content of this video review here. But to be fair, I've also been somewhat affected by the Las Vegas massacre that occurred. That put me in a really bad mood since then, and I'm also in a low-calorie deficit. So a lot of things have made a lot of my thoughts and reflections after watching this a little bit more painful than perhaps it should be. But anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and describe my experience watching these two episodes, the pilot two episodes of Star Trek Discovery. And you're welcome to tune out whenever you want, but this is my chance to sort of vent on this, and whether or not I'll even see another episode of this series. So I love Star Trek, but what the hell is this? I've seen several hundred episodes of every Star Trek TV series ever. I've seen every movie, and while I'm not technically a Trekkie or probably even a Trekker, I really do love this franchise. But is Star Trek Discovery a reboot that CBS doesn't want you to watch, or is this mainline canon what we've experienced since the inception of the TV show in the late 60s? Well, I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, it's a continuation of that series, and I think they've done some things wrong. So I'm going to talk about that here. So this is a debacle, in my opinion. I don't think there's any way to write this as anything less than a huge and tragic mistake by the studio. And I feel like I have to say something about it, which is why this is the first time I've ever even mentioned or reviewed a TV show. But this is no typical TV show. It's not your CSI or Law and Order or anything like that. This is a unique type of franchise that is a defining moment for an entire genre of science fiction / fantasy. In my opinion, this is a failed attempt to build a good series, Discovery, from a good franchise. And they failed by doing as many things as differently as possible as what has been established in the canon so far. It's like the producers deliberately changed a lot of things to make it look less like Star Trek while trying to throw in as many sounds and Trekisms as they can to sort of pretend that other stuff has any sort of validity. In my opinion, every series like this has someone trying to push the envelope as much as possible. And that's usually a good thing. But there's also usually someone to say no to the bad ideas. But it doesn't look like there's anyone here to say no to the bad ideas in at least this pilot. And I think the studio evolved the series over the last 50 years. And they stopped 12 years ago because, somewhat of the popularity of the series, and there are a lot of other events that were occurring at the same time. But up to that point, 12 years ago, with the last season of Enterprise, they tried their best to evolve and make it better. And now CBS wants to reintroduce it, though on an online service instead of on television, like in one of the primetime spots. And given what I've seen, I don't know why I should feel compelled to watch any further episodes of STD. So let me explain what I did before I watched these first two episodes. I didn't watch anything more than the trailer that came out. There's like a little over a year ago, there was like a little, like, here's what the ship is going to look like kind of trailer, which you didn't see anything, any of the actors. You know, you just saw the ship being built in you know, in a space station. And then I saw like a trailer, like a teaser or a trailer, and I was like, I'm done. I'm just going to wait until it comes out, and I'm done. And of course, I have access to, you know, the internet and social media and heard stuff here and there, but I tried really hard not to spoil myself, you know, from the experience. So I came into the show being fairly ignorant of any plot details, any of the characters, anything. And I don't think the trailers did anything to sell me on the show per se. And once I watched the 2 pilot episodes, I feel like Star Trek sold out. I feel like that didn't sell me on the series either, which is what a pilot is supposed to do. Watching the first 2 episodes cemented the decision for me not to watch this series. And I don't plan on ever watching another episode either, at least as I'm watching this video. But that, of course, could change. Anyways, but I feel like it's like the people who made the important decisions for this show didn't quite care about the material, no matter how much they tell you they did. Because the decisions that they made here showed me at least, they don't quite care as much as I do. And I'm not even one of the most hardcore fans. Or maybe they prioritize things incorrectly in developing it and making their changes. But I do feel like the producers of these 2 pilot episodes, at least, and maybe the way this show is going, they're not actually a fan of Star Trek. They're just people that they're a fan of money, and they've been hired to make this series, and maybe they didn't grow up on it, and maybe they surrounded themselves by a few people that did, but they're the ones making decisions. They're the ones calling the shot and not being too interested in it. What we see is not a fair representation of an evolution of this series. And I feel like this failure, if it does indeed putter out like Enterprise did 12 years ago, that'll be used as an excuse to say that there's no market for Star Trek. I mean, it's bad enough they didn't put it on a mainstream network. They put it on a pay-for network. They have to pay $10 a month to get access to this show. And then they only showed one of the 2 episodes free online or free on the network. And then you had to buy the online network or torrent it or whatever in order to see the rest. So before I go off into a lot of my negative points about this, because most of them are going to be negative, I do want to say that they did get right a couple things. They did get right space combat. I feel like whoever did the space combat here, that they understood. These people were probably hardcore Trekkies. That they had probably watched every single iteration of any sort of combat whatsoever in space in this series and said, let's see if we can do something better. So I can't speak highly enough about space combat. And I think some of the Federation Klingon storytelling actually had some positive aspects of it. I think that some of the creators or the people that were actually scripting probably knew what they were doing. But I do think that the studio got so much else wrong, and that's essentially the rest of this video. So the rest of this video is going to be on my complaints about this. So let's talk about the production. The costumes here are totally different than really anything we've seen before as far as the mainline characters. It's somewhat reminiscent of Enterprise and somewhat reminiscent of DS9 in my opinion, and maybe some elements of Voyager. But I think that they went to such an extent to essentially pretty up these costumes, litter a lot of gold and silver metal within it, that they look stylized, like too stylized, in a way that doesn't fit within the series, despite there being elements. Like if you could take away the gold and silver flecks and the metal and all that kind of stuff, but you leave like the emblems and stuff like that, that's close enough. But the mesh metal, like shiny gold and silver, I thought was overdone. The Abrams reboot of Star Trek, you know, the movies, I think that does a really good job of showing how to make the retro uniforms stylish in a new era, you know, of today, that look like they're higher quality and more detailed versions of what we would expect in this series at this time, 10 years before essentially the J.J. Abrams series takes off and the original series television shows are produced. Even the Federation ships, I would say these Klingon ships too, they all seem ornate, like too, like, I don't want to say stylized, I don't want to overuse that, but they look like they're maybe going too far. You know, it would be one thing if this is hundreds of years in the future in the Star Trek universe, but at the time that the original series is being shot, I just feel like they don't quite match up with the older designs of the original series, or even Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager. I felt those were more practical. And I feel like going between the series from the Next Generation through Voyager was all relatively smooth and consistent and somewhat evolutionary as far as the design elements and the costumes and the production, stuff like that. And like you could tell that they were building up and improving and things were evolving. I hate overusing the word evolve, but you know what I'm saying. But I feel like this show, the studio's not willing to go boldly where nobody went before, but to retread the same time period over and over. And you didn't need to go back to Enterprise. You didn't need to go back to 10 years before the original series. You could have just continued past Voyager and go beyond. But they have to keep bringing it back to sometime in the middle or in the past. And I don't understand where that desire comes from. When the Enterprise went into the past in one of their movies, one with the Borg, it was not an immensely popular movie. I don't think it was sufficient enough to justify the Enterprise series being developed, and I think that was one of the reasons why Enterprise got canned, because they kept going back into an older period of time and they couldn't do anything with it in a way that was interesting, that they couldn't have better done at a time period after Voyager returned from deep space, the other end of the quadrant, or in the other quadrant, Alpha Quadrant or whatever. And so there are issues just in terms of plot and timeline, and creating another series and burying it in the middle of the Star Trek timeline that only really the hardcore Trekkies would really know. So what we see is an overproduced mess that seems like it's in the future of the Star Trek series that many of us grew up on, but it's buried in the past, and it just doesn't seem like it fits. And I don't believe a creative reboot of sorts or redesign of the series is justified given what they're doing. Like, everything looks like it would fit in a time past Voyager, but it's like they made the wrong decision and didn't understand how to adapt to that decision. The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager were not designed to either erase or overwrite the original series. You know, the Kirk, Spock, etc. series that started it all. Even Enterprise, in my opinion, did its best with better technology to fit what you're looking at into the universe with minimal retconning. In other words, you know, the classic line of it's more like a submarine. You look at all the dials and all the things that are kind of thrown in there, and it's designed to look a little bit more retro despite the better technology used to produce the series. And believe me, I'm not faulting STD, Star Trek Discovery, for a failure to use good special effects. I thought special effects were actually really good. I thought they understand how to use a high level of detail. And I do think, at least in certain scenes, they did try to make some elements look like what you might expect in the original series. But I don't think they did it enough consistently throughout the show. Things like the costumes looking too pretty, as I've mentioned, and and maybe overdeveloped in certain parts. And with the space suits and the tactical LEDs throughout, and the computer basically narrating everything. I realize there's an expositional reason for it, but that's not something we saw in essentially a spacesuit 20 plus years later with Spock using it in essentially the first Star Trek movie, the motion picture. And I just feel like they tried to redesign Star Trek instead of taking existing designs and make them better. It just feels like they decided to reboot the universe again. First the movies reboot the universe because they can't use half of the Star Trek IP, and now the TV series can't quite use the other half. And so there's this weird disassociation. I would have expected Paramount and CBS to say, look, we're going to do some sharing here so we can each have a profit or something. And I just feel like both of these are somewhat less than the sum of those two parts. And for those who think I'm intolerant of change, I've enjoyed the entire Star Trek series from the original series through Voyager, and I even found a lot of things to like in Enterprise, which I believe better honors the franchise than Discovery does today. It just doesn't look like Star Trek. It doesn't feel like Star Trek. I'm not saying that I want bulbs and knobs from 50 years ago. I just want general designs that are modernized for high fidelity cameras and screens. But it doesn't have to be an exact replica of 1967 Star Trek. It doesn't have to be super retro, but I do believe it can fill in the blanks and keep the overall architecture, which are in line with the series. I'm actually fine with the graphics. You can have great art, but the wrong style. And that happens in comics, that happens in science fiction, that happens in other genres too. There's just too much gold and silver over the costumes, and then there's the hologram tech. We haven't seen hologram tech used like this anywhere in the series until DS9, and they had to do with lesser technology to make that kind of thing happen. But that's over 100 years in the future from this show, and here it's just commonplace for some reason. So I don't know how they can justify this when it's not consistent with the technology of the series. And I only recognized a few things that looked like they belonged in Star Trek, like the phasers, for example, and one of the tricorders. They kind of felt like they belonged. Also, I saw the revealing things that we never saw in the original series. There is an across-space mind meld. That just doesn't make sense to me. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like wrong science fiction or fantasy universe, bro. And why are we seeing so many new races? And there's only like two that we've ever seen, and that's the Vulcans and Klingons. Everyone else is like really bizarre. And we even see a female robot. It's got like a helmet and blinking LEDs, and there's also some other guy. Looks like an ordinary, like a black guy or just an ordinary guy, but he's got some weird helmet on, as if like, what is this doing for him? It's just got a bunch of LEDs on it. I'm not sure what that means. Anyways, just there are some changes that they made that are unsettling. I just don't feel fit in with this moment in time. I know that in some of the movies they do show a wide range of aliens here, but it feels like, hey, here's a bunch of brand new ones that we're just going to throw in here. So I don't know. Just yeah. And speaking of aliens, let's talk about the big change in the room, the Klingons. If they had never mentioned Klingons and that these aliens spoke a different language, and there's no reason to assume these are Klingon, we would just assume these are another alien because they don't match what we understand as Klingons, since really the original series as the basis, and then the original movie that came out, and everything we've seen since then. What we see today is just inconsistent, and they don't act or operate or even look the way we expect Klingons to look and act. Somehow these are now terrorists who do raiding parties like Vikings. And they had an honor-bound system that's now been turned into some sort of weird system that doesn't seem to rely on honor. That's not to say that some of the Klingons couldn't be treacherous before. It's just that there's a lot of homage and theater and intent towards honor, you know. And it's like these people don't give a crap about honor. It just seems like this is really off. I don't know why they made these Klingons super ugly and overdone with the prosthetics. You know, when they reboot Star Trek again, another 12 years from now, after this fails, are they going to use, like, what, immobile rock creatures as Klingons? Like, how further are they going to go? Or will they recognize this as a mistake? Some of the Klingon dynamics just didn't make sense. You know, and I was hoping that these would be like another strain of Klingons that we just hadn't seen before. But there's like 6 or 7 others that showed up in holograms that look just like these. So at a minimum, a third of the entire Klingon race is represented by this brand new species 10 years before the original series, when they were essentially human-looking Klingons. Anyways, you know, somehow, you know, here's this part here. I didn't really like the sudden claim to defending individuality, like racial individuality or something like that, that's never appeared anywhere in Klingon conversations that I can remember in any other form of Star Trek whatsoever. The original Klingons were supposed to be an allusion to the Russians in the original series, and we know those people were not radical individualists, right? They were literally a collectivist empire, socialist authoritarians. Basically everything people like me have hated as a political system. And now the Klingons are these people, you know, these sort of radical individualists that are focused on racial purity and just I don't know, it's just hard to deal with. You know, it would have been less insulting if they just made a race called the Trumpkins, an orange-skinned group of aliens or something, and make that this group of racial purists or some bullshit. At least you could say, okay, this is your dumb political moment. But when you retcon an entire alien species into something it has never been, or something we've not seen before, that's the wrong decision. They just look foreign. They're overdeveloped physically with all the prosthetics, and they don't even look real. Like there's a scene with that one guy, I don't remember his name, he's like laying on the ground, he's about to die, and the mask is like pushed. It's off. And it's like, this is not good. You know, at least when they had the prosthetics before, where it's just like the forehead, someone's face could be sort of like off to the side, and it's not like smushed. I also didn't like having to read through several minutes of the entire time these Klingons were on screen. The series started off with them, and I'm sitting here reading and reading and reading and listening to these actors who've never spoke Klingon before, buried in prosthetics, talking very slow, and trying to speak these phonetic words very slowly because they just can't do them in a way that's even consistent with the trained actors who tried Klingon 12 to 20 years ago or more. These hairless, multicolored Klingons with crazy costumes and overdone makeup or whatever, it's just, they're just not what I grew up with. You know, the Klingons were an extremely evolved species by the time we were done with the entire Star Trek series with Enterprise in like, what, 2004, 2005? They were pretty damn refined at that point. And they've changed, not just physically. They're suicide bombers. You know, they do these terrorist raids, and they look completely different, and they speak slowly, and they're hairless. I don't know. These don't look like the Klingons that I expect. And think of it from a cosplayer's perspective. You're a cosplayer. You want to dress as a Klingon. Now you have to bury yourself in prosthetics like the ones in Star Trek Discovery. Absolutely dumb decision. The people who made this decision have never been cosplayers and don't even know them. So now let's move on to characters. Another weak point in this series. I understand Star Trek is not supposed to be as much about intercrew conflict, and obviously they're trying to focus on that now. But when it really comes down to it, when you look at all the characters in this show, all the conflict is around this one woman, Michael. Woman named Michael. It's all around her. No one else is essentially bitching out at each other. No one else is essentially being mean and evil and vindictive and doing all this crazy stuff. It's her. She walks in a room and she starts sassing off to people or pushing people aside, like that tall alien, whose name I can't remember at the moment. You know, in that flashback scene, the first time she meets the captain, she's basically being a bitch to her. I mean, she's pretending to be a Vulcan, yet she can't even feign a lack of emotion the first time she's talking with someone else. I don't know. Just that one character is the weakness of this entire pilot episode. Not even about the elements of the plot. And yeah, she kills the Klingon by an accident and blah, blah, blah. She starts a war and blah, blah. That's not what I'm talking about. This is not a desirable crewmate to serve under, to serve over, or to serve with. And Sarek, he's different. If anyone has ever watched episodes with Sarek, he's different now. He's more human. He's more sassy and warm to some extent. Progress does not have to be an insult to those like me who resist it or think differently. Being insulting to a chunk of your audience is not the way to go and is not progress. And that's what we see here. We see this, let's see if we can evolve characters by making a really bad one and then revolve the series around it. I just don't think that was smart. And now she's hanging out with Sarek, Spock's dad, and I guess maybe she's adopted or something, so I guess she's Spock's sister. And never heard of her before. And Sarek's acting differently than he's never ever acted like this. And we see him 10 years later, and he's exactly what you expect of Vulcans, the prototypical Vulcan, and now he's a punk, in my opinion, compared to, like, he's more human than Spock. I don't know. Just, anyways. But one character I did like is Saru, whatever his name was. I thought he was actually pretty deep as a character and interesting, if a bit cowardly, but that's a character trait. And that's a character that you can use. The captain that got killed off, very interesting character that I want to know about. Oh, she's dead. So we're stuck with a mean girl that doesn't seem to have, what is it? Characteristics that are appealing. That's our star of the series. I don't know. Not good. Who are we supposed to relate to? I'm not talking about race or gender. I need a straight white male who's conservative. No, I'm not talking about any of that bullshit. I'm talking about a character that's not just interesting, but involving. I just feel like nobody has a chance to show their character, at least in these two pilot episodes. And the one character we got plenty of is not interesting. Stories are not just built on actions or events or conflict. They're built on characters that are interesting and relatable and that you want to be around. And all the people that seemed interesting and you want to get to know, I mean, there wasn't really a focus on them except if they were unfortunate enough to have to interact with this woman, Michael. And of course, most of them seem to have been killed. I don't know. I haven't seen the third episode yet. May not ever. And I just don't know if this is enough to make this series go. This one woman. There have to be other interesting characters because this woman is not what you build a series on. The main protagonist of the show so far is incompetent. And I honestly don't know how the series is ever going to make money. It's on an obscure online network that costs money just, to pay for, just to watch this show, I'm not sure if they'll make any money on merchandising, especially if they keep killing off the interesting characters and leave us with an unlikable one. And this heel turn by Michael against her captain honestly made no damn sense. I really like the Asian woman captain more than her first officer, and I think the wrong character died on that Klingon ship. I'm sorry. I can't say it any other way. I lost all sympathy for her when she nerve pinched her boss, and then after her boss got killed, I just honestly lost interest. I mean, I hope this series doesn't essentially become Trek of Thrones or something like that. It's just not good. So let's talk about the politics here. I don't personally care whether or not this TV series ever satisfies the Bechdel test or any of these other feminist third wave BS tests. That's not the point of this series. If the whole reason you're interested in taking over this series is to inject a bunch of political, feminist, progressive BS politics into this and turn this series into something that it's not, fuck you. I have no interest in watching this. I don't see why anyone in this studio would consciously say, I want to purposely alienate part of the fan base of this series in order to score political points. If you're doing that, screw you too. I don't understand why you have to change the existing characters and details and alien races and all this kind of stuff in order to have progress. That's not progress. You don't understand what Star Trek is about. For example, in the movies, they decided, we're just going to make Sulu gay. He's not a gay character for 50 fucking years, and all of a sudden you're going to make him gay. And now in the TV show, they have to do something similar. Make Klingons radical individualists and racial purists. Like, that's not progress. That's not advancing anything. That's regression. Star Trek is not diversity for the sake of diversity. It's not change for the sake of change. It's how mankind can improve through voluntary cooperation and tolerance. That is progress. That's something conservatives and liberals and progressives can agree on, and libertarians can agree on. If you're trying to make this pilot, make this series something successful, you don't stab any of these political groups. You don't try to alienate part of your base. We have 50 years of backstory, both canon and stuff that's now no longer canon, but is sort of flavoring the experience. Or, people that have read and watched these things, the fan films, stuff like that, they still feel like they're part of something. And that something is good. And that something does not have to be changed for political reasons. I don't care if you're a conservative and want to make this a Christian kind of show. I don't care if you're progressive and want to make this a feminist type of show. That's not what this is for. Do that with your own new series. Don't do that with this series. You don't build a show by not only targeting half the political audience and then telling them they shouldn't watch, which is partially what the actor who plays the captain did apparently before this. He apparently said, don't watch a series if you're an old fan, and he apparently encouraged people to watch just for sort of the conflict and discussions. You can argue about the different. That's not what Star Trek is for. Star Trek is good, and has a noble purpose that can be used by the different political factions to sort of enable them or make their point of view look good. But it's not supposed to be like a third wave feminist type of show. And if you're turning it into that, that's not good, and you're going to alienate the majority of fans. People that don't fall off after the pilot may not continue to watch the series as it progresses. I don't dislike the pilot because I'm a conservative or a libertarian or whatever, or because I'm a privileged white male or a cis-normative binary, whatever the hell. I dislike this because I'm a Star Trek fan. I'm a fan of science fiction, science fantasy, and fantasy, and I'm a fan of good characters and storytelling. And the type of progressivism that's all over this pair of pilot episodes is nothing like the actual progress that Gene Roddenberry himself and countless others after him who took responsibility in the franchise believed in. This is a change, not for the better, in my opinion. Progressivism in this universe seems to be more about filling in the checkboxes. We've never had a female cyborg crewmate before. We've never had an Asian female captain. We've never focused on a supporting character instead of distributing it throughout the show for on all of them as sort of an ensemble cast type of thing. We've never had a pilot start out on a ship or a space station that's not the main setting of the series. We've never had a series focus on a black person. No, wait, on a female. No, wait, a black female. We've never had a series focus on only one character, all that kind of stuff. You don't have to turn Star Trek into that. The whole purpose of Star Trek is you have that ensemble cast, and you have a bunch of interesting characters, and you have some episodes focus on one, some on the other, some on conflicts between a few, and some on conflicts between the other, and between cameos from others, and all this kind of, there's a lot of things you can do. And you introduce more characters. The types of grounds they're attempting to break here are not necessarily good ones that advance the series. And nobody complained about Commander Sisko and DS9 being black, or about Commander Janeway being a woman. Many of us were actually looking forward to a Captain Sulu, for example, like a movie or a TV series, which unfortunately never materialized. This reminds me of the original Battlestar Galactica TV show, the episode, all the shows that I used to watch when I was a kid, and then its remake on TV on the Sci-Fi Network. The people that made that new version of Battlestar Galactica, or BSG, on Sci-Fi essentially told old school fans like myself that this series was not going to be like it, or even an homage to the series. That if you're an old fan and you want this to be like that, then don't watch. And that's essentially the vibe that I'm getting from this show here. If you really like the old type of progressivism that Star Trek pioneered and was a positive example of, that nearly everyone can enjoy, we're not doing that. We're doing something else. What? And I know the show started out with essentially a Bechdel test, and then it probably went through a litany of other tests as they developed the show. But this should not be a playground for social justice warriors. I feel like this is an explicit attempt to mirror the 2016 election into a science fiction series that people are going to watch because they got sick of the 2016 election and the 2017 political BS afterwards. So that's right. If you're tired of the BS politics of today, this Star Trek apparently is not aimed at being a reprieve from it. Want to watch a science fantasy show set a couple hundred years in the future? Star Trek? That's even better. Wait, what? They want to drag this progressive intersectionality stuff into the show? That's not going to make it a good show. And social justice, it started out in the Catholic Church, and it was about, charity, voluntary cooperation, and it wasn't necessarily about shoving identity politics down everyone's throat. And I also didn't like the fact that I could tell that Michelle Yeoh, I couldn't remember her character's name, but I could tell that she was going to die because as you're watching the show, in the credits it says special guest star Michelle Yeoh. And it's like they're telegraphing that she's going to die. You know what? In these pilot episodes, you got to keep that stuff on the down low. Don't put it in the opening credits because you're just tipping off people like me as to what's going to happen. And I've heard the excuse before that no Star Trek series starts out strong. I think that's irrelevant here. No other Star Trek series started out deliberately slapping its fans in the face like this episode does. The least two problems I had with this was the story and the actions, the special effects and all that. But some of the worst things about this was the dialogue, particularly with the Klingon dialogue, but the dialogue between the humans, and of course the inconsistency with the franchise itself. I don't even understand where Discovery came into play here. They deliberately made the pilot episode of the Discovery not take place on the Discovery. I just thought that was dumb. And of course in this show, somehow this woman, Michael, is Spock's adopted sister. You know, if they never mentioned Sarek, I would have literally not thought that the actor playing this character was this character. His personality and the things that he says are nothing like the original Sarek, as I've listed before, and ultimately this is a sort of a historical revisionism. It's basically a reboot under the pretense of something else. Jason Isaacs, that actor who plays the captain, said that they are throwing away the legacy of Kirk and Picard, at least according to one article that I saw online. And apparently he dared fans not to see Star Trek Discovery. Does that make sense to you? He apparently said, "I don't care about the diehard Star Trek fans. I look forward to the fun of them being outraged." So a diehard fan like me will watch the opening 2 episodes, but even diehard fans die. Because this show was largely advertised beforehand as a SJW version of Star Trek, that's going to help kill it unless they do something to change it for the better. They need to recognize the mistakes that they're making and make it better. And then maybe people like me will tune in to watch more episodes. And another character I didn't like was this overtly white male racist character. And like they actually scripted him in essentially as a white male racist, the way he mentions race. You know, it's the goddamn future. We're not still dealing with that shit. And when Michael walks in on him talking with the captain, you know, that admiral, and then she starts mouthing off to him or whatever, and then he mouths off back to her about something about blah blah so and so and race. I lost it. I was like, you're ruining a good thing. Stop it. And I don't want to say things like this are predictable, because I wouldn't have necessarily predicted that interaction, but these kind of things showing up is like, oh yeah, of course they would do that. Oh yeah, of course they would do that. And then it went off the rails, you know, with Michael nerve pinching the captain briefly and then trying to start the war. It's like, this doesn't make sense. This woman's crazy. And actually the first time he mentioned race was the first time ever associated the word race in Star Trek to like black or white or brown or anything like that, and not alien race. If you ever watch any of the Star Trek TV shows or movies or anything like that, anytime they mention race, it's always in the form of like Klingon is an alien race, human is an alien race. That's the race they talk about. When this guy flippantly replied back to her about, you should know about race or whatever he said, it's the first time I've ever in watching a Star Trek show that I actually thought of like a race based on skin, not an actual alien race. It was just really surreal. Also, we saw the Europa got destroyed. The Europa, we're already hearing enough about Europe being overrun by tens of millions of migrants coming over from the Middle East and North Africa, and they go in and wreck that. Again, that's something where you wouldn't predict that in the show, but having seen it happen, you're like, okay, is that something they want? Is that something on a checklist that they did because of the word Europa and it being destroyed or something? Like, I don't know. It just seems like it was pretty petty. I just feel like the creators of the show or the studio or the people that make the shots decided to seek out as many possible moments to bring up race relations and other social justice causes into these first 2 episodes as much as possible. It's like they were trying to go through that checklist. You know, are they going to turn Michael now into some sort of Antifa member, like the Resistance or something like that? You know, I'm honestly more interested in the Orville than this. You know, I once knew a guy named Tracy, for example, a long time ago when I was growing up, but that's not an excuse to make this woman Michael. Yeah, it feels like they're putting together another female Ghostbusters or a fanforstic, you know, crap show, and that's not what you should turn Star Trek into. But I would like to see them actually forge new ground in this franchise rather than constantly revisit the past like they did with Enterprise and like they're now doing with Discovery, and of course like what they're doing with this off-timeline set of Star Trek movies. You know, they're boldly retreading where the series has gone before over and over and over. This also reminds me of the Transformers movie series, where instead of making a new project on existing material, it's destroying a good franchise with terrible material. It's like these people are deliberately targeting their audience in a bad way. People like me. And I can't imagine I'm the only person who has this problem. You know, we're seeing a bad trend here with progressives. You know, if you just want to play video games, you got to put up with social justice. You want to read comics, you got to put up with social justice. You want to watch the NFL or NBA, you got to put up with social justice. You want to watch Star Trek, you got to put up with social justice. You know, I didn't watch the last Transformers movie because of this, because I knew what that product was going to be. I can't think of any reason to waste my time watching any more of this series because I know what it's going to be. Unless I hear from either a friend who says the series got better and that they threw away some of this BS, I just don't have any interest in watching the series, you know? I just feel like nobody in the larger scene of movies and television and even comics wants to forge ahead. We're seeing constant reboots and prequels and retreads, and that's not good. That's not good for any series or any genre or any franchise or any type of like medium like TV or movies or comics or books or anything like that. One thing the series has tried to do in the past with you know, Next Generation and DS9 and Voyager and even Enterprise is add to the legacy, not subtract from it. This new studio is taking stuff away and putting in things that aren't any better. This is half Star Trek, half something else. And I don't like that something else. Right now I'm just calling it Star Trek disappointment, Star Trek depression. That's what STD means to me, other than sexually transmitted diseases. I just don't see why they couldn't have picked up after Voyager and Star Trek Nemesis. We'd already developed to a crescendo of some interesting dynamics with the Federation and the Cardassians and the Klingons and the Romulans and stuff like that. And things can get interesting there, but we can't seem to get there because of the Star Trek movies and Enterprise and Discovery. We're never going to get there. And I'm not interested in all this sabotaging work in between. This can be off canon, and then we can just continue with Voyager, Nemesis, and beyond. You know, maybe if these people try to adhere to canon, you know, that'll be good. But if they aren't trying to adhere to the very spirit of Star Trek that made it great, someone is going to have to step in and make Star Trek great again. There's nothing aspirational or optimistic about this series. It's dark and depressing. I had no issue with the level of exposition, for example, like in the beginning scenes, because it was needed. It's been 12 years and you're introducing people to the characters. It happens to be one of the characters is bad and the other character just didn't live. Oops. You know, I thought making the Star Trek emblem in the sand was dumb, but whatever. You know, there's so many nitpicks I can make into this episode, and I'll even link 3 videos I've seen, which make some really good point-by-point breakdowns of how terrible the pilot was. And these are all fans of Star Trek that love the series. But I'll digress. Bottom line is, if the studio cleans up their act, I hear they've already put 14 or 15 of these in the can, and then they got rid of the guy that's over it. And maybe if they can sort of bring things back on the second half or the next series, or however they're going to, I don't know how long these seasons are going to be, but if things pick up, maybe I'll tune in. I've got a friend, he's actually interested in STD a little bit. I mean, he wasn't as turned off ultimately in the end as much as I was. I may still see it with him, another episode, and maybe give this another chance. But right now, I'm just done. And I'm not going to hold my breath for this series to get better, because I'll die before that does. Anyways, thank you very much for putting up with this extensively long rant. I'm sure there's some out there that agree with me, but we'll just see how it goes. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.